I'm with Leidos, as Gina said. We are probably one of the largest defense contractors in the U.S. We compete with Northrop Grumman and a few others. We have a very unique program with regards to the channel because that is something that usually you don't see in a defense contracting type scenario. But we do quite a bit of work in the private sector, so we did end up developing one. As Gina said, I've been in the cybersecurity for over 20 years, almost 20 years. And went from engineering to sales to back to engineering to architect to now managing a program.
Anyway, so we are Versive. We're actually a 6-year-old machine learning company pivoted into cybersecurity, and I can get into it a little bit later. But it involves the ability to find advanced adversaries that have penetrated your typical fence line and have made it their way into your network. So it's all about the data science problem of how I use machine learning and AI effectively to go find those adversaries. And the first thing I will mention is I'm glad that Clint mentioned the 5 to-dos and that we got at least one thing right by having some co-branding slides here. So we did good on that part, Ann. But just to give everybody in the room a rough kind of dumbed down version of what cybersecurity is, I know that it is something you guys have most likely read about in the news. It's everywhere. I think there's almost too much noise and noise in the industry, for lack of a better term. Just to give you guys a good analogy of what we're going to call the security stack here is, and being a very large services provider, us being an independent software vendor, typically the problem becomes if you are protecting your castle, which is essentially your data. So imagine your data being in the middle of this fortified castle. There's 2 ways to look at cybersecurity. One is, how do I put all the perimeters in place to keep people out? Or 2, how is it that I assume that they're going to gain access because the modern day adversary is getting more and more complex, they will find ways in. Where Versive comes in parallel with Leidos is making the assumption that in certain times they will get in, and how is it that I'm going to actually find them in the middle of this castle. And the best way to think about that is fences on the side for perimeter tools. I'm sure you heard about firewalls, all things like that. Typically where Versive comes in advanced security, where you really are now needing to have people, is the motion sensors within your house, and you almost have to assume these guys are in there hiding, and how is it that you're going to use the right combination of tools, technology, and people to properly find them. So I'll stop there and see if Ann has anything to add.
Yeah, we're kind of taking a backwards approach on the slides. Leidos does look at security from this perspective. The castle analogy is when we look at every layer from the perimeter on in all the way to the user and the source of the information and intelligence, which is the most critical asset we consider in our businesses that we manage and control their security posture. So is this?
There we go. So basically, this is the Versive perspective of how we view the cybersecurity world, and then Ann will be able to elaborate on the Leidos side of the house. So basically, like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, is that Versive takes the approach to make the assumption that the modern day adversary, again, will breach your network. It's just a matter of when and why. They can do that by phishing emails. I'm sure all of your security teams are all over you about that. I actually came from a company called Yodlee way back in the day selling financial data APIs and would always ignore those emails from our security team because I didn't know it was a big deal. Jumped into cybersecurity and realized that's actually the biggest way that adversaries breach the network indeed. And that no matter how many tools you put in place, typically you need to be conscious that gaps do exist, and you have a couple ways to fill those gaps. There are security tools that work if you have the in-house security team that's experienced enough to deal with them. But oftentimes, if you look at the security market in general, 85% of that market buys from the outsourced security side of the house, the Leidoses or managed security service providers. And a lot of even large enterprises that do have the bandwidth in order to tackle most of their security needs actually do use outsourced security too. So from a small 70-person Series B company, it made sense to tackle the 85% of a $40 billion market that's growing by putting partnerships in place based on the fact that legacy security is evolving and that it does take a very great combination of tools that I would say like Versive and great security people that have been in the industry for 20 plus years on the Leidos side of the house. So why don't we move to the next slide, Ann? You can dive more into this.
Okay, so as Ryan was saying, when the combination comes together, Leidos is kind of the overlay service provider that looks at the technologies that a company will have in place or the technologies that are actually out in the marketplace, and there are a ton. So we get a little bit of vendor fatigue on my side of the house because I'm constantly getting, like when Clint's conversation or presentation, 20 calls a day because it's the next best cybersecurity product, it's going to do this, that, and the other, and everything else, but it's actually not true half the time, or most of the time.
We all use the same exact buzzwords, by the way, machine learning, data science. So it's very hard to break through the noise there, but continue.
Yeah, it all blurs together at the end of the day. So the way Leidos looks at the world and the way I look at the world is when we're going through technologies and looking for technologies to partner with and to bring into our channel program, we look at the way an attack will happen. And we call it the kill chain, and it's actually something that's been developed over the years, and it's used kind of as an industry standard, as a framework with regards to trying to understand the steps an adversary will take to get into your network and actually achieve their objective. So we look at technologies that can help with reconnaissance, then we look at technologies that can prevent weaponizing, we look at technologies that can identify delivery, we look at technologies that can stop an exploitation, and installation, and we of course look to what we're going to use to prevent command and control to be established, and the overall objective to be established. So when we look at a company, we'll go through the entire kill chain and see where they're weak, and see what technologies we have in our portfolio that will meet them where their weaknesses are based on this framework. So this helps us cut down the noise with regards to the amount of vendors that are out there that are claiming to do the next best and greatest thing. The other issue that comes into play, because these technologies are relatively complex and they require a lot of tuning and a lot of training, as Ryan said earlier, you're hearing a lot of buzzwords around artificial intelligence and machine learning and this, that, and the other. It's great and it's working well, but it needs to be trained. And a lot of people don't realize that. You know, when you're out selling and looking at these point products, for those products to actually work well, it actually requires a team to make them work. So when we look at the different technologies that can support, you know, filling the gaps in the kill chain, we're very cognizant and very skeptical of one size fits all, and you can guarantee there's going to be a human element involved in any deployment of a technology like this, which is kind of where we reside as those experts that understand how those technologies should all work together.
One thing I would ask to Anne that I think is interesting from a security perspective is, if you go back to the castle analogy, you don't need to go there, but that really, if you're thinking about technologies that protect the perimeter, a lot of those are automated these days effectively, and you actually don't need too many humans on point there. And if you look at as it's going inside of hack, that's where the humans are becoming more necessary. So it's the proper balance always of machine learning, which helps automating certain things, but you're still needing humans to add context at some point in that castle analogy, but it's definitely moving from the perimeter inside of the network or inside of the castle here. So I think that's something that really was important when we were actually figuring out the X's and O's of our partnership.
Yes, very true. So I kind of spoke a little bit about the history, but as you can see, we are a service provider, and we are a combination of SAIC and Lockheed Martin, publicly traded, been doing this a long time. So we do have the area of expertise and actually helped design quite a few of the key technologies you see kind of in the mainstream kind of vendor noise out there. We were architects with regards to the first GRC that was ever deployed. Our team on the SIM side, which is Splunk, everyone's heard of Splunk, I'm sure, in this room. We did some key design work around what a SIM should look like back in the day. So we've taken that experience to determine how to build a channel program based on the capabilities of the technology as opposed to just reselling, and built a strategy from there. And these are all just accreditations about our super secret clearance and what we can do and the type of data we get to see every day to try to stop attacks and prevent bad things from happening across our critical infrastructure, our economy, and over the globe. So we have quite a bit of an experience.
And the one thing I would add is as the 70-person startup that we are, you can imagine how partnering with a Leidos, once we're going into mutual customers and talking about what we do, being able to say that we work with them has been extremely helpful. We can go into some details there. But again, with the people plus technology analogy, said it twice, but That's been very valuable to open the door. Again, when we're talking about the security stack where there's no one size fits all type solution.
So when I was starting the channel program and building it out, it was my goal and strategy to find the right partners that actually, as I mentioned earlier, fill the gap from a security perspective as opposed to reselling and volume and sales and that sort of infrastructure, that sort of typical infrastructure you go along with when you're trying to get out there and just build market share and whatnot. It's always important because revenue is important, but given the work that we do, it was just as equally as important to find the right technologies that would come in to help us solve serious problems, and the hope was always that the right team would be in place and there would be a balance from there. So we just created this slide to kind of give you an idea of what the criteria was and how we view the world, or how I viewed the world in trying to design the program. When looking at technologies, I look at technologies that help us apply them to the castle analogy as well as the defense and depth analogy, plus now there's a user centricity approach and look with regards to finding where the weak spots are, and this is actually where Versive came into play. It's become more and more apparent to us that there's a lot of things happening inside the network that are making the company much more vulnerable. The insider threat has become the most serious threat right now to most of our clients in the Fortune 500 and up. So understanding behaviors and anomalies around how a user accesses applications and works with data and creates information and creates intelligence is very, very important, and it actually helps us build a bigger security strategy that go back to those, those block and tackle tools that you see as you get farther away from the castle and farther out to the perimeter. So in building the channel strategy, it was the technology first to protect the customer, and then all of the business aspects that go along with a more traditional channel program. And Versive hit the mark on the insider threat for us, and so that was one of the reasons we decided to go down the path with them.
Yeah, and I would also add a large part of that was Ann's ability to really add consulting to the mix. When you're going into any company that has kind of this patchwork combination of securities, a lot of where we struggled with early was working with teams that couldn't make the best use of our product in general, and being able to have Ann's type consulting background or even leverage other Leidos experts, given we do have our own in-house security experts, being able to really figure out where value can be added the quickest is kind of step one in figuring out the big solution, is working with what customers already have on site, which in security nowadays is this combination of 15-year-old tools up to next generation tools like that. So having that experience from the start has been extremely helpful to be that trusted advisor with the combination of the Leidos Versive partnership, I would say.
So what happened when we went through a technical review and kind of did our own internal due diligence with regards to whether the Versive technology would be something that would fit into our portfolio, we went down the path kind of mimicking what Clinton was saying earlier, is we created the joint value proposition and created kind of the story and the messaging around what the technology brings to the table for our experts who are in the field protecting our customers' infrastructures and networks. So we went down that path of creating that and trying to understand that value. And we did a lot of selling to ourselves inside to really make sure we had a succinct message and we were clear with exactly what we could do technically and the value proposition for the customer from a protection perspective.
Yep, and one thing I would add here that I actually definitely learned the hard way was when you're talking to all these resellers, or as we call it, managed security service providers, they're pretty much the next wave of managed service providers in general. What kept happening to me was I would talk to them and they would say, that's a very interesting product, Ryan, you're using all the buzzword, right? So we'll have another conversation, but none of these partners were willing to use their own customers to actually talk to us. It was only really when I made it easy for Ann and her team to evaluate a mutual customer, as Clint said, that really made sense from a Leidos perspective to bring their resources into it. We realized very quickly that the need for Leidos was actually more apparent once we got that, customer involved, because we're not in the business of providing security services. We provide a product, and rather than going out and hiring, 3 more ex-CIA guys, which are very, very hard to find these days, it made a lot more sense to bring the mutual customer who already was bought into Versive and really start from scratch from there. And luckily, we had a relationship where they said Versive was a must-have. So we kind of made Leidos work around Versive in that situation. And we did get lucky in the fact that given Anne's kill train strategy and kind of where we came in, that she could help with the initial consulting. She could fit the Versive picture in perfectly. And then on top of that, one thing that was also very interesting is we were actually experiencing a problem with an AI product. That in order to make an AI product work in general, you need data, right? And you need machine learning that is very good at recognizing patterns. And in the customers we were talking to in general, a big pain point was even having the east-west data flow within the network that makes our engine actually valuable. So on the direct sales side, we'd have people that loved our product, but we would go in and then now we're talking to IT people who can't enable the data we need. And Anne actually brought in one of her partners, a company called Zentera, that gave us the data we need to make our AI engine tick. So it was, basically that's what we mean by a three-way partnership is she understood where there was gaps, understood that that was my biggest problem from a direct sales perspective is how do I shortcut and stop talking to IT teams all day when it's really the security teams that make the decisions on the security side. And that's a whole relationship that I don't want to go into now. But she made it very simple by introducing this NetFlow partner that really the partnership became then a data provider with a machine learning engine and then Leidos as people that essentially were taking our outputs and giving it that extra value to the customer itself. So that is mostly the first three bullets. So then I would say the fun part started after we figured out that whole value proposition is now we can co-target customers. I work very closely with the sales team, and it's basically a tried and true solution that with these three combinations of two product providers, I would say, and services, that there's less excuses or less friction once you're actually engaging a partner and you have the whole kind of full end-to-end spectrum figured out and actually tried and tested. And at the end of the day, even a referenceable customer that's willing to speak on our behalf too. So I would say this fund's just getting started for us in terms of really kind of leveraging that. And it took probably about, 6 months to really kind of iron out the kinks as to how it would work. And one thing I would add is luckily the mutual customer you had was very open and willing to knowing that we might not get it 100% right the first time. Luckily, I think we did pretty good on that part of it. But really, we couldn't have made it possible without those, I think, kind of four things falling in parallel.
Yeah, and that consultative approach from the very beginning and understanding and using a framework like the kill chain was kind of where in our strategy around channel was why we're able to be flexible and agile and fit technologies into the right spots given what the customer is trying to accomplish and what the customer's requirements and security posture should be. So it's a channel program with a lot of kind of unique flexibility and agility to it. It's more in the partnership alignment, I guess, is the best way to putting it. Because when you say channel, there's definitely a stigma that comes along with that, and we're not quite a typical channel partner per se, or we have a typical channel with distribution and all that sort of stuff, but we do set up very creative agreements to make the flow through, if it's 2 or 3 partners down the path, to make sure we cover what the customer needs covered are there. Those pieces are always in place. So we rely a lot on the reselling agreements, but we usually use that for just kind of a baseline, so we can kind of start talking openly about things that are there, and if we need to throw in a technology into a solution we're designing, we can. And then along with the reselling agreement, then we actually will start building, the go-to-market strategy, which will involve and include kind of goals for different verticals where we see the technologies fitting well, revenue targets, of course, and just creative ways to solve problems that we're seeing that are usually vertical specific. And like for Ryan and I, we've talked about the financial services sector, but we're kind of getting caught up in biotech and media and a few others. So it's kind of interesting all over the place. There's common problems across all sectors, but it's always good to be able to bring in partners that have background and knowledge, and you can actually speak to a sector-specific situation as well. So
totally. And I would add one thing is that when we first started talking, my whole argument was, hey, security is an extremely horizontal vertical. Everybody has important IP to protect in some way, shape, or form. And on paper, that sounded great, but she was kind of the first one to tell me that, hey, Ryan, you probably should pick a couple verticals and not say you can sell to every company in the world, because it's not that easy to do that. So that was definitely one thing that really getting vertical focus kind of at the beginning and using actual customers where you can just speak their IP-specific language was definitely vital to actually removing kind of the friction as we go along here.
Yeah. Anything else? I think that's about it, what we wanted to cover. I hope that made sense from a cybersecurity perspective.
Cool.